There's a decision that doesn't come from hate or coldness or some modern whim. It comes when your body starts reacting before your mind does, when your throat tightens up just thinking about visiting, when a simple "how are you?" from inside the house feels like an invisible hook pulling you back to an old place. Cutting off your own family for some people isn't an act of war. It's a late act of survival. It's when your soul, already tired of negotiating with the same script, says quietly, "If I stay here, I lose myself." This is often misunderstood by outsiders, because there's a powerful social myth. Family is always a shelter, and if it's not a shelter, it should be forgiven anyway. But the psyche doesn't live on slogans. The psyche lives on repeated experiences. And when the repeated experiences within a family system are invasion, humiliation, chronic guilt, manipulation, emotional violence, or contempt, the word family stops being a synonym for belonging and becomes a synonym for danger. What many call drama might actually be an attempt to reclaim your own sanity. Through Carl Jung's lens, this topic isn't just social, it's deeply symbolic. The family is the first world. It's there that the persona starts being built, the role you learn to play to be accepted. In some homes, the persona is a light mask that protects and allows growth. In others, it turns into a prison. You only have a place if you're the strong one, the obedient one, the one who doesn't complain, the one who takes care of everyone, the one who doesn't embarrass, the one who swallows their own truth. And when someone spends years sustaining a persona like that, there comes a time when the self, what the person is inside, when they're not performing, starts demanding air. Not with pretty phrases, with symptoms, with anxiety, with depression, with exhaustion, with the persistent feeling of living someone else's life, not your own. That's when a very specific pain appears, common in mature men and women. The pain of realizing that loyalty has turned into self-abandonment. You're loyal, you visit, you help, you stay quiet, you swallow, you play the expected role. And even so, something inside you shrinks. With every encounter, you come home with the same weight in your chest, like you've gone back in time. You find yourself talking like before, defending yourself like before, giving in like before. Jung would say that when we enter certain environments, old complexes are activated. A complex is like a charged emotional core that takes the wheel for moments. You don't react as an adult. You react as that old version that learned to survive in that house. And then the inevitable question arises, am I living a relationship in the present or repeating a story that programmed me? Cutting ties in this context can be an attempt to interrupt the repetition. But it's not a simple attempt. It almost always comes mixed with guilt, grief, and ambivalence. The person doesn't cut because they feel nothing. Often they cut precisely because they feel too much, and feel in a way that destroys them. They've already tried talking and were ridiculed. They've already tried setting boundaries and were called ungrateful. They've already tried pulling away and were dragged back by emotional blackmail. They've already tried being mature and realized that maturity there was just an elegant way of tolerating the intolerable. Here's an essential point. There's a difference between accepting and submitting. The practical philosophy that inspires Stoicism teaches us to distinguish what's under our control and what isn't. You can control your decisions, your attitudes, your boundaries. You can't control if the family will understand, if they'll respect, if they'll change. And when someone insists for years on changing what isn't under their control, a father who doesn't listen, a mother who invades, a sibling who humiliates, an entire system that needs a scapegoat, the person gets exhausted. The decision to cut can then be the first time they choose to govern what's theirs, their presence, their time, their energy, their dignity. But why does this hurt so much? Because symbolically, cutting the family isn't just cutting people. It's cutting internal images. It's messing with archetypes. The figure of the father, the mother, the siblings, the clan. This exists inside the psyche even when it exists outside. Jung would remind us that we carry internal parents and internal mothers. Voices, expectations, prohibitions, permissions. Sometimes by pulling away from the real father, the person discovers that the internal father is still alive, criticizing, demanding, diminishing. Sometimes by pulling away from the real mother, the person discovers that the internal mother still blames, still infantilizes, still invades. That's why cutting external contact can be necessary, but it's not always enough. The external cut is a closed door. The harder work is organizing the house inside. And there's an even more delicate scenario, when the family isn't openly terrible, but is emotionally draining. There are no screams, but there are jabs. No physical violence, but subtle contempt. No direct insult, but constant sarcasm. No explicit abandonment, but indifference. The person grows up with the feeling that they're never enough. And when, as an adult, they try to get close, they feel the same chill. The problem is that this kind of wound is invisible. Outsiders don't see bruises, they just see someone overreacting. But the psyche knows, what hurts you doesn't need to be loud to be deep. A lot of people cut off their family after a limit event, an episode of public humiliation, a betrayal, an inheritance dispute, a manipulation involving children, an illness where the absence was glaring, a life choice that was attacked with cruelty. But underneath the event, there's usually an accumulation. The person doesn't cut because of one bad day. They cut because of years of small misalignments. They cut because they realize that every time they get close, they pay a psychic toll. And there comes a time when the mind asks, why do I pay a toll to exist? Jung would call this turning point a demand of the individuation process, becoming who you are, instead of remaining just who the family needs you to be. And individuation isn't teenage rebellion. It's painful maturity. It's realizing that you can love and still not live together, can respect and still not submit, can honor the history and still not repeat the pattern. Individuation starts when the person stops asking for internal permission to live. And often, the family is the place that resists this change the most, because family systems tend to protect the old balance, even if that balance is sick. There's also the family shadow. The shadow isn't just evil, it's what the system doesn't want to see. In many families, someone is tasked with carrying the group's shadow. The sensitive one becomes weak, the questioner becomes difficult, the one who denounces becomes ungrateful, the one who doesn't fit becomes problem. This role is devastating. The person grows up trying to prove they're not that, or conforms and becomes that. Cutting ties, for whoever was chosen as the shadow's depository, can be the first real act of rescue. I'm not going to carry what's not mine anymore. At the same time, honesty is needed. Sometimes the cut isn't just liberation, it's also defense. There may be cases where the person cuts to not face their own part in the dynamic, to not deal with inevitable conflicts, to avoid emotional responsibility. Jung would never reduce a complex human phenomenon to a single answer. He would invite introspection. Am I pulling away for clarity or for escape? Am I protecting my integrity or avoiding growth? Am I setting a boundary or repeating a pattern of rupture that's already happened in other areas of my life? This question isn't for blaming, it's for maturing. Because cutting a family has psychic consequences. Grief, a sense of symbolic orphanhood, fear of being wrong, relief mixed with sadness, a freedom that scares. And if the person doesn't sustain this with awareness, they can fall into extremes, either harden and turn to stone, or come back out of guilt and dissolve again. Maturity is in the middle. Keep the boundary and process the grief. Keep the decision and care for the wound. Don't romanticize the family, but also don't romanticize the cut as if it were a trophy. Maybe the central question of this topic is simple and profound. What is family when the family doesn't protect? Jung would say that in many cases the person needs to build an internal family, a psychic structure that offers what was missing: support, order, truth, warmth, dignity. And this doesn't happen with speeches. It happens with repeated choices. Choosing environments where you don't need to shrink. Choosing relationships where respect isn't a prize. Choosing silence when conversation turns to poison. Choosing distance when closeness turns to illness. This is a practical ethic. Not destroy the other, but not destroy yourself to keep the other comfortable. And there's a detail that gives dignity to all this. Cutting ties can be, paradoxically, an act of self-love. Not a romantic love, but a sober love. the commitment to not betray yourself anymore. Adult life at some point demands this commitment, and that's when psychology stops being theory and becomes a map, so you don't confuse guilt with awareness, submission with virtue, and repeated suffering with duty. Cutting the family in practice rarely happens in a single day. Before the cut, there's usually a long season of trying the right way, trying to talk calmly and being interrupted, trying to set a boundary and hearing that it's a lack of love, trying to pull away a bit and being pulled back by guilt, by blackmail, by accusations of ingratitude. The person tries because they still believe in the idea that if they explain better, if they're more patient, if they choose the right words, they'll finally be understood. But there's a difference between dialogue and insistence. When the other doesn't want to see, you can talk your whole life and still be accused of exaggeration. Through Carl Jung's lens, this scenario isn't just a conflict between individuals, it's a conflict with an old psychic system. The family is a symbolic field where roles crystallize early. The responsible one, the fragile one, the difficult one, the appeaser, the one who commands, the invisible one. And a family system tends to protect its roles because the roles maintain the known balance, even if it's a sick balance. When someone changes, the whole system feels threatened. Sometimes the person only starts to mature emotionally, becomes more aware, starts therapy, learns to say no, starts naming what they feel, and suddenly becomes arrogant, changed, influenced, selfish. The system isn't reacting to the real person. It's reacting to the risk of losing control over them. An internal sign that this process is underway is moral fatigue. It's not just sadness, it's a weariness of conscience. The person starts to notice that every encounter requires performance. They prepare before going, rehearse responses, choose what they can't say, decide what topics to avoid, promise themselves they won't react, that they'll be mature. And when they come home, they feel a disproportionate drop in energy, like they've gone through an ordeal. This is a precious psychological datum. The body is saying that environment is a trigger. The mind can rationalize, but the body denounces. Jung would say that complexes were activated, old emotional cores taking command and downgrading the ego's freedom. You're not just visiting, you're being pulled into a story. Many family cuts are born precisely when the person realizes that their maturity is being used against them. You're the evolved one, forgive. You're the strong one, endure. You're the one who understands, don't take it personally. It sounds like praise, but it's a trap. The role of the mature one becomes permission for the other not to change. The person realizes that forgiveness, there, became a password for repetition. And then a cruel and liberating question arises. How long will my kindness serve as an excuse for someone else's cruelty? Another common gear is invasion disguised as care. The family that calls too much, asks too much, opines too much, decides too much, and calls it love. And if the person complains, comes the phrase, I just want what's best for you. Jung helps see the blind spot. Not all care is care. Sometimes it's control. And control within a family usually feeds on two currencies, guilt and obligation. Guilt says, you owe me. Obligation says, this is your role. When these currencies circulate for years, the person can grow up believing that autonomy is selfishness and that boundary is rejection. So they learn to betray themselves politely. And one day the self demands, enough. There's also the scapegoat phenomenon, which Jung would understand as a form of shadow projection. The shadow is what the group doesn't want to recognize. Aggression, envy, resentment, fragility, moral failures, contradictions. In some families, the shadow is dumped on a specific person, usually the most sensitive, the one who questions, the one who doesn't fit, or the one who dares to name what everyone pretends not to see. This person becomes the official problem. If they pull away, the system loses the deposit where it threw emotional garbage. That's why when they try to leave, they might be attacked with disproportionate intensity. It's not just missing them. It's the system's fear of facing its own shadow without an intermediary. In situations like this, the cut doesn't happen just from hurt. It happens from clarity. The person finally understands that certain relationships are structurally incapable of reciprocity. They realize that by getting close, their dignity is negotiated, their truth is ridiculed, their boundaries are punished, their vulnerability is used as a weapon. And then they start applying a very simple life principle. I can respect the other without making myself available to be hurt. This isn't revenge, it's psychological hygiene. But the mind always tries to sabotage this movement with a dangerous confusion, confusing boundary with cruelty. A lot of people were trained to believe that saying no is attacking, that pulling away is hating, that prioritizing your own health is betraying. Jung would say that these beliefs are part of the internalized family morality, a set of invisible commandments that keep the individual tied to the clan. And when the person breaks this commandment, they feel guilt even when they're doing what's right. Guilt, in this case, isn't awareness. It's conditioning. It's the old control speaking from inside. It's also common for the cut to come after a last attempt at coherence. The person decides to set clear boundaries. I won't accept yelling anymore. I won't discuss with offense. I won't allow talking like that about my spouse. Don't expose my kids. I won't participate in this anymore. And then something revealing happens. Instead of the boundary being respected, the boundary is interpreted as aggression. And here a mature criterion appears. Whoever truly loves you might not like your boundary, but learns to respect it. Whoever needs to control you uses your boundary as proof that you're the problem. At this point, the cut can be partial or total. Sometimes it's an emotional distancing with minimal presence. Sometimes it's physical distance. Sometimes it's silence for a period. And for many, this is lived as grief, because it is grief. Not just grief for the real people, but grief for the imagined family, for the old hope that one day it'll get better, for the dream of finally being seen. Jung understood this kind of grief well. When an internal image dies, the psyche shakes. The person isn't just pulling away from someone, they're saying goodbye to a necessary fantasy. And necessary fantasies are hard to let go because for years, they were what kept the person trying. The problem is that right after the cut, internal traps emerge. One of them is hardening. Now I don't need anyone. It seems like strength, but it can be just protection. Another is coming back out of guilt. Maybe I overreacted. And then the cycle restarts. Emotional maturity is in recognizing that the decision, to be healthy, needs to be sustained by reflection, not impulse. The cut that comes from clarity is silent and stable. The cut that comes from explosion can turn into regret. That's why observing what motivated the rupture is fundamental. Was it a necessary boundary or an attempt to punish? Was it a choice to preserve integrity or a way to flee from any conflict? Jung wouldn't condemn the cut, but he also wouldn't romanticize it. He would ask, what part of you is trying to be born with this act? In many cases, the cut is the first time the person chooses themselves. And choosing yourself is a hard act for whoever was raised on loyalty as self-sacrifice. The person starts learning an inner discipline, not reacting to attack, not giving in to automatic guilt, not getting into endless justifications. They understand that they don't control the family's judgment, but they control their own conduct, control their presence, control their response, control how much they allow the old narrative to define their worth. In concrete life, this requires simple and firm practices. Not getting into circular conversations that drain. Not responding immediately to provocations. Not trying to prove the decision. Not using the cut to feed hate. Because hate maintains the bond in a shadowy way. You stay tied, just with a chain of anger. Real freedom has less noise. It's when the person can say inside, I don't need them to understand for me to stay whole. It's also important to recognize a point that almost no one says out loud. Cutting the family can reveal a void. A space that was previously occupied by obligation, by tension, by drama, by expectation. When this space opens, the person asks, and now, who am I without this role? Jung would call this a passage from the persona to a life closer to the self. Without the role of the appeaser, the strong one, the guilty one, the responsible one, the person needs to discover their identity without a script. This scares, but it also liberates. And it's here that maturity consolidates, when the individual learns to build belonging outside the clan, not for revenge but for sanity, chosen bonds, relationships with respect, friendships with reciprocity, environments where the person doesn't need to shrink to fit. Finally, there's a silent truth. Some families change when they lose access. Others never change. And the person needs to be at peace with that. Because insisting on someone else's change is going back to the old place. The place of trying to control the uncontrollable. Adult life asks for something else. Posture, clarity, boundaries, and responsibility for your own path. This doesn't eliminate the pain, but it prevents the pain from becoming destiny. There's a moment when the distancing stops being just a practical decision and starts becoming an inner journey. Because cutting the family doesn't erase what was lived. It just interrupts direct access to the trigger. What remains often is an internal house still inhabited by old voices, the criticism, the guilt, the obligation, the fear of being a bad person, the worry of overreacting. That's why, for Jung, the hardest part isn't closing the door from outside. It's reorganizing what's left inside. A clear sign that the family bond was more than a common relationship is how much it stays alive, even in distance. The person may have no contact but still argues mentally with the mother, with the father, with the sibling. Still rehearses responses. Still tries to prove something in silence. Still catches themselves seeking approval, even knowing it might never come. Jung would explain this as the persistence of internal parental images, psychic figures that formed early and became authorities in the inner world. In healthy families, these internal figures become structuring references. In dysfunctional families, they become tribunals. And when the person cuts external contact, the internal tribunal can get even louder, because now it's not counterbalanced by a coexistence that, despite being toxic, offered some sense of belonging, even if sick. It's here that guilt appears with force, and it's crucial to understand. Not all guilt is a sign of error. Often, guilt is a sign of conditioning. There are people who were raised to feel guilt whenever they prioritize themselves. They learn that love is obedience, that respect is submission, that maturity is silence. In these cases, when they finally set a real boundary, the body reacts as if committing a sin. The guilt isn't saying you did wrong, it's saying you broke the old pact. Jung would say that the psyche is crossing a conflict between the old persona, the good son, the good daughter, the one who keeps the peace, and the self's demand for integrity. And integrity sometimes is disappointing unfair expectations. Another element that arises in this journey is the grief for what never existed. It's not just grief for the relationship, it's grief for the possibility. The person doesn't mourn just the real mother, the real father, the real sibling. They mourn the idea of mother, the idea of father, the idea of family that should have been and wasn't. This is a hard grief because there's no funeral. No one sees, no one validates. And still, it weighs. Jung would understand this as the death of an idealized archetypal image. The family is shelter. When this image falls, the psyche needs to reorganize its map of belonging. And this can open an existential void. If my place of origin isn't home, where is home? A lot of people try to fill this void quickly, with rushed relationships, excessive work, distraction, with a posture of, I feel nothing. But denial charges interest. The more mature path is to sustain the void as a space for reconstruction, like a cleared lot after a necessary demolition. It's not comfortable, but it's honest. And honesty in this case is healing. There's also a delicate point that Jung would call personal shadow activated by the cut. By pulling away, the person may feel intense anger, even hate, and get scared by it. How can I feel this about my own family? But the anger doesn't come from nowhere. Generally, it's the feeling that was forbidden for years. Anger here doesn't mean cruelty. It means late boundary. It means the psychic energy that says, this was too much. The problem is when this anger becomes identity, when the person stays tied to the family through resentment. Because resentment is a form of bond. You cut outside, but stay trapped inside. The mature integration of anger is something else. Recognize, validate, understand what it protects, and then use it as fuel for boundaries, not as fire to consume your own life. This is one of the points where the practical philosophy of life, inspired by Stoicism, offers an axis without needing to become a speech. There's something deeply liberating in accepting that you don't control others' judgment. The family can tell the story however they want, can call you ungrateful, cold, cruel, influenced, and you can spend years trying to correct that narrative, or you can choose not to be governed by it. The discipline here is simple and hard. Sustain your decision without needing to convince. This isn't insensitivity, it's self-control. It's choosing not to hand over your peace to the tribunal of those who don't want to understand you. At the same time, maturity isn't becoming a fortress. Maturity is learning to build a center. And a center is capable of two things at once: firmness and humanity. That's why another challenge after the cut is learning to trust outside the family system. Many people, after an invasive or aggressive family history, end up with an internal pattern. If even my family hurts me, who won't? This thought is understandable, but it can become a prison. Jung would say that early experiences shape expectations, and expectations shape choices. If you expect threat, you protect too much or choose relationships that confirm threat. The work is gradual. Build chosen bonds, with clear boundaries, observing consistency, cultivating reciprocity. It's not opening the door to anyone. It's learning that there's a difference between intimacy and invasion. Another little talked about aspect is identity reconstruction. Many people only understood themselves within the family role: the responsible one, the peacemaker, the problem, the one who brings pride, the one who brings trouble. When contact is cut, these labels lose the stage, and then a strange silence arises. Who am I without the role they gave me? Jung would call this a rare opportunity for individuation. It's not a stroll, it's a crossing, because the ego got used to a script. And when the script disappears, the person needs to write another. This can generate anxiety, but it also creates a kind of freedom that few know, living by choice, not by obligation. In this process, two opposite temptations arise. The first is coming back out of longing for familiarity, even if the familiarity hurts. The second is hardening and declaring war on the past, as if that resolves it. Emotional maturity is found in a quieter middle. Keep the boundary and process the grief. This requires patience with yourself. Requires recognizing that certain dates hurt, that certain memories come back, that certain smells and music ignite an entire past. Requires tolerating ambivalence, feeling relief and sadness at the same time. This is a sign of health, not weakness. The mature psyche can sustain complexity. It's also common for the person to feel alone in a new way after cutting the family. It's not the common everyday loneliness. It's an existential loneliness, the feeling of not having an origin tribe. And here Jung would offer a useful image. When the person separates from the clan, they enter the path of the individual. The individual, for a time, walks in open terrain. There's no group protection, but there's possibility of authenticity. With time, if they sustain this path with honesty, they find truer belongings. People who choose them for who they are, not for the role they fulfill. There's still a practical issue that usually determines if the cut will become healing or just rupture: the internal boundary. Because many people cut outside, but stay open inside. Any message disorganizes. Any news knocks down. Any family opinion decides the day's mood. This shows that the external boundary wasn't accompanied by a psychic boundary. The psychic boundary is when you can hear that they talked about you and still not fall apart. When you can see a photo, remember an episode, and still remain in the present. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent. It means building internal stability. And how do you build this stability without complicated speeches? With small, repeated choices. Not feeding conversations that put you back in the old role. Not getting into endless justifications. Not accepting encounters to pretend everything's fine when that makes you sick. Not using social media as a window to spy on the past. And mainly, building a life routine that strengthens you inside. Simple habits, body care, meaningful work, reciprocal friendships, silence that's not escape, but presence. Life needs to offer new proofs to your internal system. Now I'm safe. Without this, the cut becomes just absence, and absence without reconstruction becomes void. The deepest point, in the Jungian view, is that cutting the family can be an attempt to recover your own soul. And soul, here, isn't vague poetry. It's what gives meaning, coherence, integrity. It's the place where you don't need to lie to exist. If family coexistence requires constant lying about what you feel, about what you think, about what you want, about what you live, then the psyche starts to get sick. Healing starts when truth finds space. Sometimes that space is distance, but the distance doesn't need to be a monument of bitterness. It can be a calm act. An act of someone who finally learned to treat themselves with respect. And respect in maturity isn't just respecting others. It's also respecting your own health, your own dignity, your own boundary. Cutting your own family is one of the most misinterpreted decisions out there precisely because it messes with an almost sacred idea. That origin should mean shelter. But the psyche doesn't respond to ideas, it responds to experiences. And when the repeated experience is pain, invasion, humiliation, chronic guilt, or disrespect, the body starts saying no long before the mind can explain. Through Carl Jung's lens, this act isn't just social, it's symbolic. It's a movement of individuation, this process where the person stops living as an extension of the clan and starts becoming someone whole. And this path is usually silent and costly. It's not paid just with distance but with grief, with the feeling of not belonging, with old guilt trying to pull back, with longing for what should have existed and didn't. The hardest point is understanding that the external cut doesn't automatically end the internal bond. The parental images stay alive inside us for a long time. The voice that criticizes, the voice that blames, the voice that tells you to shut up, the voice that says you should endure more. And sometimes the real work starts after you pull away. Because then the question shifts. It's no longer how do I deal with them, but how do I deal with what they left in me? When the person has the courage to face this, not to feed resentment, but to recover freedom, something reorganizes inside. Life stops being a reaction to the past and starts being a choice in the present. There's also a distinction that matures everything. Guilt isn't always awareness. Sometimes guilt is conditioning. In families where love was confused with obedience, any boundary becomes lack of love. The person is trained to feel guilt when prioritizing themselves, and when they finally prioritize, the guilt appears like an alarm, but not necessarily a true alarm. It might just be the old pact asking for continuity. Come back to the role. The adult step is learning to hear this alarm without obeying automatically. It's recognizing, I feel guilt, but that doesn't prove I'm wrong. And here comes a practical ethic, simple and demanding. The boundary that protects your integrity doesn't need hate to be legitimate. A lot of people believe that to pull away, they need to hate. But hate is a dark tie. It keeps the family alive inside, taking up space. The freer act is the one that doesn't make noise, the one that doesn't need to win anyone. It's the act of someone who says calmly, I can't continue like this anymore, and chooses a life that doesn't require self-abandonment to keep others' peace. This doesn't mean that cutting is always the best answer for all cases. It means that when someone cuts with clarity, they're usually responding to a repetition that became unsustainable. And maturity isn't in judging someone else's decision from an ideal. Maturity is in recognizing the real. There are families that nurture, and there are families that drain. There are bonds that mature, and there are bonds that rot. There are conversations that heal, and there are conversations that just reopen the wound. If there's a possible synthesis, it's this. Adult life requires discernment between loyalty and self-sacrifice. True loyalty doesn't ask you to destroy yourself. And true love doesn't require you to stay available to be hurt. Jung would say that the psyche seeks wholeness, not submission. And this wholeness passes through a question that a lot of people avoid. Am I being faithful to my psychic health, or just faithful to my old role? There's a deep dignity in whoever chooses to build an internal center, a center that doesn't depend on family approval to exist, a center that doesn't unravel with every judgment, a center that sustains sadness without going back to humiliation, a center that accepts grief without turning grief into condemnation. And little by little, this center allows something rare. You can remember without falling apart, can feel longing without betraying yourself, can keep distance without hardening, can move forward without needing to prove anything. If this video touched some intimate place in you, like the video so it reaches more people living this silent conflict, write in the comments which part of this story most describes what you felt: guilt, relief, grief, or the need for boundary. Share with someone who might be stuck between obligation and health, and subscribe to the channel to keep reflecting deeply on psychology and real life, with calm, clarity, and maturity.